pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
Newly elected President Franklin Delano Roosevelt faced the greatest economic crisis in American history. 3 years into the Great Depression, unemployment stood at a staggering 25%. The nation's banking system was on the verge of bankruptcy, and public confidence was zero.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper.
Aided by an energetic and forward-thinking cabinet known as the Brain Trust, FDR's administration launched a head-on assault on the Depression.
It's like quitting a morgue for the open woods.
Happy days are here again, the skies above are clear.
During Roosevelt's first 100 days in office, emergency banking legislation reopened stable banks and for the first time guaranteed deposits. Work relief programs created jobs for the unemployed, and the Federal Emergency Relief Act provided funds for the destitute. Farm subsidy legislation sought to stabilize and raise crop prices, and the Tennessee Valley Authority promised jobs and electric power to a great swath of the rural South. Perhaps Roosevelt's greatest accomplishment was to give hope to the American people. He brought a vast reservoir of confidence to the presidency, a positive outlook, and a reassuring voice to a troubled nation.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
My parents loved Franklin Roosevelt, not because the New Deal affected them so much in any special way, but because of the fact that they had the impression that he was not against African Americans. They felt that he liked and respected black people.
My grandfather, who was a staunch Republican, did not like FDR whatsoever. When I would talk to my grandfather and he would tell me stories about working for the CCC and working in the CCC camp, I'd say, well, you know, FDR is the one who gave you this job and you don't like him. He'd say, oh no, he was a communist.
Meeting him was like uncorking a bottle of champagne.
I am an exceedingly mild-mannered person, a practitioner of peace, both domestic and foreign, a believer in the capitalistic system, and for my breakfast, a devotee of scrambled eggs.
He was a charismatic aristocrat. In other words, there was very little, if you looked at his background, that would allow you to think that he was going to be able to relate to the common person.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking.
Among the things that he had was the ability to communicate through this brand new mass electronic medium called the radio, a sense of intimacy with millions of ordinary Americans. After Roosevelt's first fireside chats, in the following week, in 1 week, the White House received 450,000 letters from just ordinary Americans, just responding at will to this presidential talk. And the White House mailroom had to hire something like 115 or 120 people to handle this volume of mail.
He could be flexible. Where Hoover was rigid, he would consider all kinds of ideas. It was said that he usually agreed with the last person who talked with him on any given day. So he was willing to experiment.
Almost immediately, what he starts to do is institute a series of programs that are designed simply to get people temporary work. And if that means putting them on programs that the federal government will pay for, building programs around the country, or even direct relief programs, he's willing to do that. And the object is pretty simple. When you get people working, what they have is income. And when you have income, what you can do is you can start to not only provide for your family, but you can start to build back up an economy that is in a death spiral.
I got a position at this bank after being out of work for 2 years, and am I happy?
I don't know whether it's Roosevelt, beer, or this good old summer weather, but business is sure booming.
I'm beginning to make a little money and thinking very seriously of paying off a few of my old 1929 debts.
The priority agenda was not simply ending the Depression or alleviating the effects of the Depression. The priority agenda was to restructure American society and the American economy in such a way that future depressions would be far less likely, and that what wealth there was in the society would be more equitably distributed, and more Americans would participate in what we might broadly call the mainstream of American social and economic life.
To this end, in 1935, Roosevelt backed the National Labor Relations Act, or Wagner Act, that put the power of the federal government behind workers' right to organize.
The Wagner Act made illegal many of the anti-union and discriminatory and violent activities of managers against workers. It said that it was in the national interest to form trade unions, and that the rights of workers to free speech, to assembly, will be protected within the bosom of the corporation itself, within the bosom of the workplace itself. This is, in fact, a very radical extension of government power. Think about it for a moment. If you have a factory in Birmingham, Alabama, imagine the racial divisions that exist there. Imagine the difficulties of black and white workers in Birmingham voting anywhere, outside the factory, in it. And imagine federal officials coming to that steel plant in Birmingham and having a ballot box in which blacks and whites themselves are voting secretly and are voting against their traditional, foremen and superintendents who've been running that show for 60 years. That has a tremendously democratic potential.
All we wanted was a president who would hold the light for us while we went out and organized.
Come all of you good workers, good news to you I'll tell, of how the good old Union has come in here to dwell. Which side are you?
With corporations and politicians wary of the new Wagner Act, organized labor itself reached a defining moment. Long dominated by the skilled craftsmen of the American Federation of Labor, a new mandate was proposed to organize all workers together, skilled and unskilled.
It's one of the famous moments in American organized labor history. 1935 convention, John L. Lewis, who's this big, burly guy with this wild hair and kind of one giant eyebrow across his forehead, gets up at the convention and he says, the time has come to organize the working people of America. The president of the Carpenters Union gets up and he says, John, nice speech. We're not going to do that. We've never done that. We're not doing it now. Now, John L. Lewis is a reasonable kind of guy. He just hears an opposing opinion, throws himself at the president of the Carpenters Union, hits him in the face. They start swinging away at each other. They're rolling around on the floor of the AFL convention. The other delegates rush over and separate them. John L. Lewis gets up, he brushes himself off, he walks out of the AFL convention, and he never comes back. He then forms a new labor federation, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, whose sole purpose is to organize the major industries of America, which means organizing unskilled workers.
This union maid was wise to the tricks of company spies. She couldn't be fooled by a company stool. She'd always organize the guys. She'd always get her way.
Though the first strikes were planned for the steel industry, workers at the General Motors plants in Flint, Michigan, jumped the gun.
What they decided to do is stage a sit-down strike. In other words, what they did, instead of leaving the plant, they sat down right inside the plant and they said, we're not leaving until we get the union recognition from General Motors that the federal government says we have a right to have. And that's a dramatic thing to do. What it also is, it's an incredibly good tactic, because it means that General Motors can't run its plant. And suddenly this huge General Motors empire that stretched all around the United States was starting to creak. It was having a hard time maintaining production. And finally, General Motors had no choice. And so in February 1937, they recognized the right of these workers to form a union called the United Automobile Workers. That was the largest industrial corporation in the world, brought to its knees by a handful of guys inside their plan. When that happened, the floodgates were open for the CIO.
Fellow workers, we want peace and prosperity in this country here. That's what we're fighting for, and that's what we're going to have.
Chrysler, U.S. Steel, and General Electric soon followed. And though there were notable holdouts, by 1939, the core of industrial America was organized. For many workers who remained outside union protection, Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which set a minimum wage, maximum hours, and finally curbed the use of child labor. These worker protections were protested on both sides by those who thought they went too far and those who thought they didn't go far enough in covering all workers. But for all its flaws, New Deal labor legislation forever altered the landscape between labor and business and the government's role in their relationship.
When there's no question anymore that it's going to stay, American working life was utterly different. Ordinary people, for the first time, feel a direct connection to their government. They feel it's their government. This was a moment in time when the working class felt they had a stake in their government, and their government had a stake in them.
One constant aspect of the Great Depression was the public's high level of fear. Fear of economic insecurity mainly, but also fear that the government could not cope with the crisis, that the American way of life could not be sustained. Roosevelt sought to diminish this fear by passing legislation that provided psychological as well as financial relief. The FDIC insured bank deposits. The Securities and Exchange Commission brought oversight to the stock markets. New Deal labor legislation protected workers from their employers. But no single piece of legislation identified the New Deal like the Social Security Act. Vast, complicated, contentious, and incomplete, it nevertheless changed Americans and their relationship with the federal government forever.
We remember that as probably the single most lasting and consequential achievement of the New Deal. And its very title, Social Security Act, is a reminder of what the core agenda of the New Deal was, to make life more secure for more people. That is the alpha and the omega, it seems to me, of what the New Deal was all about.
We can never insure 100% of the population against 100% of the hazards and vicissitudes of life, but we have tried to frame a law which will give some measure of protection to the average citizen and to his family against the loss of a job and against poverty-stricken old age.
Social Security had to accomplish two real economic objectives: to make old age more secure and to protect against unemployment. Accepted today, it was radical at the time.
It's an act set up to transfer money from those who have jobs to retirees. Vast majority of Americans had no way to retire on pensions. By the time they could no longer work, they had no means of support. And so it was addressing that social problem. What it was also doing was setting up a mechanism that made it possible for people to retire at a reasonably young age and open up jobs for younger people. Because once people stepped out of a job at 65, knowing that they had some way to support themselves, well, of course, a job would open up and you would get younger workers in. And just in the same way that unions were meant to get income into the hands of working people, Social Security was going to get income into the hands of retirees. And of course, again, that basic idea is then they'll have something to spend, and you'll spend your way out of depression.
Social Security neither covered everyone nor satisfied everyone. As with labor legislation, political compromise had given the bill an awkward shape.
Most women were excluded. Most African Americans, male and female, were excluded. The dominant reason is really nothing more than discrimination. Throughout the 1930s, the Southern Democratic bloc had veto power over an awful lot of New Deal legislation. Franklin Roosevelt depended on Southern politicians in Capitol Hill to get his programs through. And what they did not want to see was a program that provided economic security to African Americans who were living under a system of racial domination in the South. It excluded job categories that were predominantly African American. So farm laborers, they were excluded. So too were an awful lot of Latino Americans. And it would take years to make sure that coverage extended out to all those people. But the basic premise, once that premise was in place, then it could be expanded, and that was hugely important.
New Deal labor legislation, including the Social Security Act, owed much to Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins, the first female cabinet member in American history. A social worker from New York State, she had been instrumental in early legislation designed to protect immigrant factory workers.
She had a tremendous credibility. She presided over the expansion of the welfare state and over the expansion of the laws which gave workers the right to self-organization. And so she became to be a symbol and a sort of moral force, and symbolizing that New Deal spirit. The Department of Labor building in Washington, D.C. is called the Frances Perkins Building because she symbolized its strength and its concern.
Happy days are here again, the skies above are clear again. Let us sing a song of cheer again. Happy days.
The New Deal greatly expanded the role of the federal government in the economy and in the working lives of Americans, and in that way alone changed the course of U.S. politics in the 20th century. It also forged an unlikely yet powerful political coalition, merging the traditionally Democratic South with new elements of the population just coming into their political maturity.
Roosevelt puts together an electoral coalition which dominated American political life for a long generation thereafter. It's a coalition that brings together various European-based ethnic communities whose political participation had not been particularly high before the 1930s. Polish Americans, Italian Americans, so on and so forth.
People who had been just on the verge of making it into the American middle class. Sometimes they're referred to as the working class elite, the immigrant groups, some segments of the black community, women. It was a coalition waiting to be organized, basically, and waiting to follow someone who looked like he might lead them out of the Depression. And so it came together very naturally by 1936.
Most of these groups were adversely affected by the Depression, but each had its own reasons for turning to Roosevelt and the Democrats.
Organized labor becomes critical to the New Deal and the Democratic Party almost immediately after the Wagner Act is passed. They needed to support the Democratic Party, both to reward the Democratic Party for the Wagner Act and to make sure that those protections stayed there.
Native Americans also saw some concrete benefits from the New Deal.
An interesting person who became a champion of the Indians, but even though he had his own critics too, was John Collier. What he did as Commissioner of Indian Affairs was to introduce something called the Indian New Deal, the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. And so what this did was to develop tribal constitutions and charter their communities.
It recognized the self-government that was there, increased education, increased health benefits. Overall, it's the most progressive period of Indian history.
Let Jesus lead you and Roosevelt feed you.
In a major political shift, African Americans en masse abandoned the party of Lincoln and aligned themselves with the Democrats and the New Deal.
Part of it can be explained by these direct relief programs, which did filter down to the black community, especially in urban areas. But also, to a certain degree, credit, I think, has to be given to Eleanor Roosevelt, who reached out to the black community and black organizations in ways that her husband never did, and in ways that most of her husband's advisors never did. She was really crucial in building that bridge, I think, between the upper class WASPs and the lower class blacks and lower class immigrant groups.
I hope the day will come when all the people of this country will understand that cooperation will bring us happiness.
Eleanor Roosevelt was the mortar in the New Deal coalition and a woman of tremendous influence throughout her husband's presidency. With Roosevelt's blessing, she forged a leadership role for the First Lady.
I think Eleanor Roosevelt is a deeply intriguing figure, and she used to tell a story on herself on I believe it was her honeymoon trip, actually, to Europe when she first married Franklin. At some event, she was asked a question about American politics, and she had no clue what the answer was, and she was embarrassed by this. So she set out to learn something about the life of the society of which she was a part, and its politics especially.
Her role during the New Deal was absolutely singular and very important. Not only did she try to look after the interests of women and the interests of blacks and the interests of workers, and to visibly go around the country, because FDR couldn't go around the country because of his own disability. She became the eyes, the ears, and the legs of the New Deal, and she humanized the New Deal. Even though most of them didn't alleviate the problems of the poor, Eleanor was out there looking like they were going to and talking like they were going to.
In that complete stagnation of business, of mines, and of farms, there was only one agency capable of starting things going again: the government.
In 1937, flush with re-election and backed by a solid majority in both houses of Congress, Roosevelt overreached his power in an attempt to change the composition of the Supreme Court.
In 1934 and 35, the Supreme Court began to strike down some of the early New Deal legislations, and that enraged Roosevelt. So he came into office for his second term with this landslide behind him, feeling his oats, so to speak, and looked at that court and said, I'm not going to have this happen again. I'm going to pack it. Every Supreme Court justice who doesn't resign within 6 months after turning 70, I'm going to add a member to the court. It was really a stupid idea, unsophisticated at every level, unconstitutional at every level.
I feel that the end which you desire to attain does not justify the means which you recommend.
Nobody was going to buy it. The liberals weren't going to buy it. The conservatives weren't going to buy it. And then it was unnecessary, as it turned out, because the court started to approve in 1936 major New Deal legislation.
Although frustrated in his attempt to pack the court, Roosevelt ultimately appointed an entire Supreme Court bench through constitutional means. His long and powerful tenure in the White House marked the beginning of the modern presidency.
Before the modern presidency, before FDR, Congress really ran things in terms of both domestic and foreign policy. And the modern presidency puts the president in control. And the only control really over the power of the modern presidency is the control the president has over himself, which puts us in kind of a scary situation sometimes.
Like a National Museum exhibit, America is dotted with the buildings, roads, murals, sculptures, and dams of the New Deal era. Taken together, they tell a story of great strife and hunger, lost hope, buttressed by a man and an administration committed to lifting a country up out of misery, forever altering the path of the American journey.
Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson signal the expansion, the amplification of the role of the president in the American political system. But Franklin Roosevelt is clearly the person who makes that a reality in quite a measurable way. And the presidency becomes an enormously important institution, not least of all because the executive branch now administers an institutional apparatus that is umpteen times larger than it was before the New Deal.
I think that the New Deal set the terms for political debate in the United States in every election, every political dispute since then, because we still debate issues that were raised in the New Deal. That is the nature of taxation, the nature of employment, the nature of regulation.
It made people see their world in a new way. What one auto worker said was that the major transformation for him at work was that now he could tell his foreman that he thought he was a son of a bitch. And that was something you didn't dare do in the 1930s. And that's a big deal, because suddenly you don't feel anymore that you're a second-class citizen. That's what the New Deal and welfare state legislation and the union movement did for millions and millions of people.
If the test of the New Deal's success was its effectiveness in doing battle against the Depression, on that score, it flunks badly. But if the test of the New Deal's effectiveness is, did it leave in place thereafter an institutional structure that prevented another catastrophe of this sort, and that ushered more Americans into the mainstream of American life, and that made American life in all ways and across the board more secure, more safe, more predictable, then I think it has to be judged an enormous success. The New Deal has to be recognized as an instance of truly consequential political creativity of the sort that happens very rarely in this or any other society.
We are PBS.